Hey friends, it's that time again. We're here for the Church Tech Today podcast, and we're nerding out on the topic of the day, which is AI AIO, as I call it. I've got my good friend Jason Malec here as a conversation partner. Welcome, Jason. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Kenny. Thanks a ton.
I wanted Jason on to talk about this topic that we're talking about today because if you don't know Jason, he has dedicated his life to helping organizations, I would say basically just accelerate their mission. And he's very strategic and helping with clarifying the objectives of organizations, helping to install strategies, the storytelling of that to the audiences in front of them. And I think in this season, he's doing that well with Glue AI, which is, I guess, as Glue is saying, is the AI, the unit, the initiative is basically AI powered, a trustworthy source for spiritual growth, right? And we'll get into that a little bit. What does that mean?
Mhm.
Let's get right off the bat. So, Jason, you have some interesting thoughts in that arena of AI's
Mhm.
transformative effects on the role it has in terms of digital media. We live in a digital world today. Can you share that lens of, how AI is transforming digital media and how it's reshaping content creation and distribution today? Because I want to hunker down on that specifically, because typically our conversations on AI surface level in terms of like, how can we use ChatGPT to, improve our email that we've just written, or I think we have to go deeper now, and that's why I brought you
Mhm.
on as a conversation partner. So, what are your thoughts? How does AI impact digital media in particular?
Man, that's a big question. It's a great question. I think it's a really important question, especially in this moment, because there's, if we look at kind of the big picture of artificial intelligence, Kenny, it's really the wild west right now.
Yes.
There are no real rules or guidelines or parameters. We like to talk at Blue about creating what we call redemptive AI, and that is using ethical rules and guidelines to help inform our use of it. But from a big picture perspective, I think your question's an important one because when you talk about media, you really talk about all forms of media, any kind of communication, whether print, obviously digital or physical, analog. You're talking video, you're talking audio, and all the various forms and expressions of that. What's interesting in today's day and age, and we're only just now becoming more aware of it, is that artificial intelligence is, or at least the tools that are now democratized, that are popularized to us, they are 100% dependent upon data, on content, whether video, audio, or print, analog, or digital. And what we're now realizing is that the majority of that data has actually come from us. That the book that I'm reading, the podcast that I listen to, the videos that I consume, the blogs that I read and ingest, that artificial intelligence has actually been trained on those. And the way that it does its predictive or generative responses to any prompts is by utilizing all of that data that we have generated over quite literally millennia, and then creating predictive algorithms that allow it to respond to our prompt. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. It can be actually a very good thing. And that AI has, or at least these models have ingested huge volumes of data and then use that data to create predictive algorithms to help us do our jobs better, to help me write a note to somebody that hopefully is a better version than perhaps I could do on my own. So there's real value in that.
Yeah, we hear stories where all these AI companies are running out of content to consume, right? Like that's
Hmm.
they're voraciously trying to ingest as much data and content as possible. Now, you recently wrote a very interesting article that we published on ChurchTechToday.com. If you haven't read it, for the people listening in, go look up our Napster moment, is part of the headline. You can search for it. In that article, you draw a lot of parallels between today's AI developments and the Napster era. If everyone looks
Hmm.
back into history and remembers that moment in time where that was a revolutionary time for
Hmm.
business, for culture, etc. Can you explain for people here that Napster reference and how it relates to like the current challenges that we have in terms of DRM?
Yeah, yeah. DRM means digital rights management. So, yeah, it's a fun parallel to me, in that I think it was 1999, and those of you who are younger than me and Kenny might not remember that moment. But if you're maybe over 40 or 45, you know that Napster moment, because it was a revolutionary moment in digital media. MP3s, which was the really, I think, the first, maybe the second way of transmitting audio files between digital devices. MP3s really enabled Napster to come on the scene and essentially decentralize all transmission or exchange of MP3s, the first audio files. And what that meant was the agencies, the labels, the producers, the musicians themselves no longer had control over their intellectual property. When IP was posted to any or in any digital format on any platform, it suddenly left their control. So that was the kind of early aughts, 2000, 2001, 2002. I think it was 03, 4, 5 in the time frame when Spot or Pandora and iTunes came out, and part of their value proposition to us as customers or consumers was that we could go onto their platform, and for 99 cents, or in the case of Pandora, we could pay a 9.99 fee to stream. But on iTunes, I paid 99 cents for every single song, or 9.99. You remember this, right? For an entire album, and I could download that album. In other words, they created the legal exchange between the creator and the consumer, which Napster had completely blown up and
Yeah.
decentralized. Well, if you think about the world today, large language models have scraped literally anything they can get their hands on, and a lot of things that they shouldn't have been able to get their hands on, to be able to ingest into their models, to train their models to be better at predicting on behalf of the prompts and the generative responses that they're creating. And what that means is almost all video, all audio, and all written materials have been ingested and used to train at least a half dozen, maybe dozen very large language models. I'm not sure there is a VLLM, but it is a gigantic large language model.
Yeah.
And so for an IP owner, similar to a musician or record label back in the early aughts, an IP owner today, think an author, a podcaster, a video creator that either wants to monetize their content, they want to be paid for their production, paid for whatever they put into the world, their art. They want to be paid for that. But when a large language model ingests that, once it goes into that LLM and is used for training purposes, that author, the content creator, loses all control, all ability to be given attribution, and ultimately they lose the ability to be compensated for
Yeah.
that. And so we're in another Napster moment where, much like back in the early aughts, Napster decentralized and totally disrupted music. I think we're in a much bigger Napster moment because all intellectual property has functionally been disrupted and decentralized.
Yeah, the I think we're in that little bit of a loophole moment where the
Hmm.
almost like the social contract of
That's right.
expectations of what we do and how it's consumed is in one modality, and yet technology, the innovation of AI, is now taking advantage of that loophole in a little bit because it's using it in a different way
Hmm.
than the publishers intended. And I would
Yep.
say churches are voracious consumers of content, but also publishers of content, right? We're in a 7 day production cycle to produce world-class, life-changing content every single week. And there's so many other things that a church publishes out there. How should then publishers and content creators, especially churches, pastors, nonprofit ministries, all these publishers that we have for kingdom related resources, how are they supposed to approach the intellectual property in today's world
Mm,
where the AI models are just basically grabbing all the content they can without the reciprocity of that old world contract of between publisher and
hmm
consumer? Like what
hmm
should a pastor be thinking about who doesn't live in this world of intellectual property and rights, domains, etc.? What should they be thinking about right now?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I think there's probably one general rule of thumb, and that is to be discerning, to be very thoughtful and intentional about both their intellectual property, but also their use of and promotion of artificial intelligence. And what that means is, in some ways, I believe we in the Christian community need a theology, not just an ethical praxis, but a theology of artificial intelligence, which sounds a little weird because we don't have theologies of water consumption or computer use, right? But I do think this represents enough of a sociological, psychological, emotional communication, and maybe even a theological shift that we need to be thoughtful about this. And I know there's a number of people doing work on the ethics of artificial intelligence from a Christian perspective. But I do think that a theology of artificial intelligence is lacking today, and so that's probably point one: discernment and theological in our praxis and in our thinking. I would also say that awareness of what's going on. Kenny, do you mind if I share a slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to share this slide. We've done some research at Glue on how various artificial intelligence large language models, four are represented here: GPT-4, Gemini, Anthropic, and Llama 3. And a number of these are slightly more advanced, even than they are more advanced today than they were when we ran this research. But if you look at the performance of each of these models pre-training, so models get smarter and smarter the more that you or I interact with them. So they get to know me, they get to know Kenny, they get to know you, listener, based on your behaviors, habits, questions, responses, searches, etc. But when you first begin a model, when it knows very, very little about you, on areas of personal growth, GPT-4 performs about average, two and a half, about 2.3. Gemini is actually quite good, 3.4, Anthropic 3.0, Llama 3, not so great. So you can see for all of these categories or topics: trustworthiness, alignment with the Christian faith, avoidance of an answer, relevance and clarity, quality of citations, depth of insight, overall quality. Each of the models has varying degrees or varying levels of what I would say should be consistent with or expectant of a redemptive purpose or use of artificial intelligence. And so, again, back to that very first encouragement: be discerning. Know what you're getting into when you're using a model. Should you choose to use a model? I'd say one other thing, and specifically as it relates to intellectual property, whether it's your sermon, your curriculum, your book, or any other kind of media form, when you submit something, when you import or upload something, contribute something to a large language model, it ceases to be your intellectual property.
Yeah.
It becomes, by definition, owned by or contributed to that large language model. And so I know dozens and dozens of friends who are training, their own instance of a GPT. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing. I've done it myself. I've got two or three that I regularly use. But know that when you submit content to a GPT, any large language model, it becomes the property of that. There are a couple implications. Number one, you no longer have control over that. You no longer have attribution, or you can't be compensated for it. And maybe most importantly, for those of us people of faith, when it gets commingled with everything else in that large language model, what comes out the other side, meaning what is generated from it, there's no guarantee that it will be consistent with your original intent. So just be conscious of what you train or use to train large language models.
That's super interesting. I think the privacy or those controls, the market is going to eventually catch
Mhm.
up and require and demand that.
Yes,
I mean, some of these tools are starting to address it, but for the large
they are.
part,
Yeah.
when it's corporations that are building these tools for the marketplace that are profit oriented, they're not going to lead
Mhm.
with that type of privacy and stewardship issues. Um, so, considering these challenges, do you believe our current legal frameworks are adequate, or what are the types of reforms that are needed to address that the all this stuff, the Napster moment, the AI impact on digital and media rights?
Man. So are they adequate? Absolutely not. But you can't
Yeah,
fault the legal frameworks because this, again, it's the Wild West. This is new territory.
yeah,
Prior to 1999, there was no Napster and there was no such thing as theft of intellectual property, i.e., music or MP3s from musicians or record labels. That didn't exist. So there was no, kind of loophole per se, or there was no law from which Napster was, seeking a loophole. It just didn't exist. It was brand new. We're in the exact same moment. In fact, I've heard it said that there are a number of lawsuits, Kenny, on against a lot of these large language models that are kind of working themselves through the court. Most recent one that I was paying attention to was New York Times against, I think, Anthropic. I'm not sure exactly,
yeah.
but might have been a class action against a number of large language models. Still in, still in the court system. Probably will be for quite some time. But the case that was made defending the large language models that I thought was really interesting is it goes like this, and it is an oversimplification. I'm not an attorney, so don't trust me or cite me on this, but it goes like this: if my eyeballs cover a certain line of copy on a website, I might have the capacity, if I have a photographic memory, to ingest that forever in my mind. And in the same way, a large language model, their eyeballs or whatever the technology that's used to ingest that information,
Yeah.
in the same way that my photographic memory has the capacity to remember that content in my mind and take it from them legally, large language models have used the exact same quote technology as we humans have. In other words, they're not doing anything different than a human does when they read content on the web,
Right,
when they
exactly.
watch content on the web, when they listen to audio from the web. Very interesting case if you think about it, and it's hard to defend, right? But that's the case that's being made, or at least an oversimplification of the case that's being made. I do think that IP owners have, significant grounds, and that eventually large language models are going to have to come around to, what we would call fair and ethical, equitable ownership of and distribution of intellectual property. The challenge is Pandora's out of her box, or is that the right frame? Yeah, I mean she's out. Like there's no way to get her back in. What's done is done. And so prior to, let's say, 2022, maybe even late 2023, could be even early
Mm.
2024, prior to these lawsuits being filed, everything that has been ingested, you can't get it out. I mean, you literally would have to start over from scratch. And perhaps that's, going to be the recommendation, who knows? But it'll take years to regulate. And, if you think back to the Napster issue, 1999, Napster came on the scene, had 2.5, 3 years that it just ran rampant. It took 4 to 5 years for
Yeah.
Pandora and iTunes, Apple, to essentially identify how to create digital rights management to legally, ethically connect creators and consumers. We're in that liminal space, that middle space right now.
So, given that rapid pace of AI development and even the catching up to legal, and what proactive steps can churches take right now to prepare for the future development and advancements of AI, specifically in this area of digital media rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, back to awareness, discernment, et cetera, I would say know what's going on. Kenny Jahng, a good friend of mine, likes to help to educate pastors, leaders, parachurch folk on what to be thinking about, what to do. I would pay attention to anything and everything people like Kenny and JP Poulter and others who are really helping us think through what do we need to be paying attention to. So I think that's step one. Don't put your head in the sand. This is not going away.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be aware of what's going on. I would even advocate, and this is, I hope, not controversial, you got to tinker. You have to explore. You have to be engaged and learn what some of these tools can do. I saw a study recently by Jeremy Utley, a Stanford professor on AI. He said, in less than 5 hours of experimentation, the average person can save 7.5 hours per week of administrative time. 7.5 hours per week that you as a pastor, you as a leader of your ministry can save after just 5 hours of experimentation. So I would say you got to get out there and experiment. And for the good of your community, your congregation, your staff, help them be better at what they're doing. So I think that's probably point one. And point two is get involved in helping to figure out what that theology of AI is, because I don't want we people of faith, to be naive into 5 years, 10 years, 50 years down the road, look back and go, oh, Lord, how did we? Why? You know what? Because here's the thing. Andy Crouch wrote a book about we, people of God, being creators of culture, not just consumers or critics and whatnot, but we should be on the front edge leading culture in helping to define how this technology can be used for good, for God's kingdom, and even for the wider world.
I love that. I love Andy Crouch, everything that he's saying. He's, some of the things that I remember, some really poignant pieces that he's preached on and or spoken on and written on is that like church is not here to condemn culture, but to really look forward to actually creating new culture and spaces.
That's right.
I think that's a good pivot as we close out this conversation. Can you share what you are involved in terms of that, where as a Christian and kingdom-minded leader and organization, are there any projects or things that you are actually doing to help solve that portion that pastors and ministry leaders can start to check out and at least be encouraged that there are leaders like you trying to just tackle this massive problem that we have coming down the pike for culture and society?
Yeah, that's a great intro. Thanks, Kenny. So I'm involved with a technology company called Glue that wants to connect the global church, which sounds like a big, hairy, audacious goal, and it is. But specifically as it relates to AI, we have a website, ai.glue, gloo.us, where you can get more information. But it's Glue AI is basically a technology platform that helps to create digital rights management and distribution for content owners. So if you think back to that Napster moment metaphor, it took iTunes to come along and essentially regulate the music exchange economy. And we believe there's a better way to do artificial intelligence, both from a business or content owner perspective, as well as from a consumer perspective. And so we're trying to create redemptive solutions to both protect IP owners, whether you're a pastor, preacher, parachurch organization, or a podcaster on the side who, may be involved in a church, but you're wanting to do things for, building up of God's kingdom. You are a creator. We want to help to connect those creators in ethical ways with consumers to help broaden the distribution, the exposure of your content, of the art, of your contribution to God's kingdom in ways that are hopefully different than, and I would argue better than, more redemptively oriented than the average large language model today. So again, more information, ai.glue.us. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk to and do a demo for anybody who's interested.
Awesome. And what is the best way for someone to get in touch with you?
AI.glue.us. There's actually a link on there for Aspen, which is our consumer-facing app. You're welcome to get on the waiting list for that. If you are a content owner and you want to actually consider contributing your content to what we call the kingdom-aligned large language model, we'd welcome that. There's actually a link on there for Calm, kingdom-aligned large language model. And you can actually click on that and submit a request for a demo. That'll come directly to me, and I'm happy to set that up and we can talk more.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for dropping by. Really appreciate our conversations and the thoughtfulness that you always bring. I learn something every time we sit down together. Everybody else, if you would just do me a favor and leave a comment to let me know if this has opened your eyes, and is there anything specifically in our conversation that has sparked some new thinking in your area. What should we go deeper on in the next conversation so that we can actually help equip you better for this next chapter? I'm Kenny Jahng. Thank you so much for joining us here. We'll see you next time on the Church Tech Today podcast.